you. Thank you, Lisa, Hendrik, and Mia Drag for this invitation. It's an honor to be here. Today I'd like to present my approach to teaching remote global studios. I've been experimenting with this format. Let's see, I think my slides are not advancing. Let's see, how do I do that? Okay, there we go. So I've been teaching remote global studios and experimenting with this format since 2014, and so I'd like to share my experiences. As Mia Drag mentioned, I'm both a practitioner and an educator, and as a practitioner, I'm a co-founder of Interborough. We're an architecture, urban design, and planning firm, and academically, I'm a professor at NJIT. So over the course of my career in both practice and academia, I've been mostly concerned about public space, what it is, who makes it, who uses it, and what's the role of the urban designer in all of this. And a foundation of everything I've done as an urban designer is close observation, looking closely, hanging around, spending time in a place to get to know the specifics of an environment, not only its spatial characteristics, but importantly how people of a place use it. And this type of close observation, reading the city, what we call detective work, offers clues about how to make a place better. So in projects, we've used close observation as the foundational building block. This way of working has guided my teaching over the years. And in the MIP program at NJIT, I've built a curriculum around these principles of close observation and detective work. And for this reason, in the first 10 years of teaching, I exclusively taught local studios. And with each course, I had exercises to ensure that students got out there, talked to people, looked at the physical environment, and searched for clues about how people use space. Back in the fall of 2014, for a variety of reasons, I decided for the first time to teach a non-local studio that we couldn't visit. And at that time, I had just completed 3 consecutive studios focused on post-Hurricane Sandy rebuilding in the metro region. And I thought it would be good to test our knowledge and skills and see how it could be applied elsewhere, particularly in the context of Delta cities and Delta urbanism. And I found a great opportunity with the first Global Schindler Award competition, which the focus was the development of an urban design proposal in Shenzhen, which, site I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. And the competition called for a framework for future development for this district here. The city was already focusing on this area in its redevelopment plans. Their emphasis was on replacing the existing uses with a new residential neighborhood, a kind of tabula rasa approach. The site was a former warehouse and a logistics zone. It was these uses were not considered the highest and best. There were also 2 urban villages that were related to the historic river system. So really a very interesting and challenging urban design problem for both the students and for me, but a new one, like I said, because I had always focused on local studios, never doing a site we couldn't visit. And teaching at a university like NJIT, we haven't had the resources and sponsorships that many well-endowed schools are able to attract. So we've never had the traveling studios that have become the norm at some schools. But I wanted to do the project, and so the question for me was how to develop a studio curriculum for a project that didn't violate my foundation in close observation, looking, and listening. How to design a meaningful urban design proposal that is rooted in local conditions and local spatial practice when we ourselves were thousands of miles away. And at the outset of the semester, I developed a series of exercises to encourage the studio participants to develop a sense of lived experience on the site. And the approach here was journalistic, rooted in cultural anthropology and ethnography. And I have to say that I'm so totally honored to go after Dr. Lowe because I just really admire her work so much. So the first thing we did was that we read Factory Girls from Village to City in a Changing China, Leslie Chang's amazing work. And her book describes the lives of young women who migrate from China, China's hinterland to places like Shenzhen. And her book strongly influenced my thinking, and I particularly admire her use of what social scientists call the longitudinal study, following a subject through time. And I asked each of the students to identify an individual that they found intriguing in Shenzhen and to develop a visualized portrait of that individual that explained their selection, and they had to research this person using either like journalistic accounts, books, films, videos, the kinds of things that Dr. Lowe talked about. And then the students had to illustrate that person's daily or weekly itinerary. And many students examined the social and economic trajectory of migrants on the site who were arriving as factory workers and then growing into small-scale entrepreneurs. And these portraits really shaped our proposal. Another thing that we did was we spent a lot of time on Baidu, which is, as you probably know, is China's version of Google Maps. Google, and here this is the street view. One student, Lauren Martin, spent countless hours walking the streets with Baidu to better understand pedestrian mobility, and then she made a map of the pedestrian network. And one of the things that we noticed early on, that for an obsolete industrial zone, the site was very well used and pretty lively. So the site under the radar had really become a hothouse for startup micro enterprises. And so one of the drawings that we developed early in the process was what we called our clues map, which was like a kind of cloud of color-coded observations that the students had collectively assembled. And I don't have time to really go into the details here, but basically you can see some of those micro enterprises and other things that we found. And so the project in the end was called SEZ to EZX Shenzhen Crossroads, and it was really about building on what was already there, using these kind of existing agglomerations of small and mid-sized firms, clusters of urban villages, and so on, and to use that as a kind of the basis for a next generation economic zone that facilitates the growth of migrant businesses. And so this vision was not shaped by some outside approach, but really by the accumulation of clues we found from afar. And I like to call this a kind of forensic urbanism. So I am happy to say that my students ultimately got to visit the site and make their own firsthand observations. We won 4th prize in the competition. And what was really interesting is that how many of the students were surprised that their observations from afar were not that far off. They felt, they knew the site intimately, and when they arrived, it felt eerily familiar. I had initially planned to sort of present some of these other studios. I don't have enough time, but basically we used the kind of same approach of, reading other people's perspectives about the place. I developed exercises to make people really, I guess Dr. Lowe would call it scraping, but like looking for different ways to get at the people, the practices, and the kind of artifacts that shape a place. And again, I don't have time to go into the details, but here we actually watched a lot of documentaries. We looked at a lot of Instagram accounts. This page is not loading correctly, but in any way, trying different ways to see the place. And in this case, there was no Google Street View, so it really required us to be extremely resourceful. And this project in the end was really it was organized around water equity, and we won 4th prize, and the students got to go to India actually, and this project won the last year's Architect Magazine Studio Prize. So, of course, I think it's always better to visit a place rather than to try to construct a mediated understanding. But I do believe that our method of looking from these different perspectives, really looking very, very carefully and intensively through a particular lens, has a value. You could call it an oligoptic approach, in which we can see a few things well. And here the students were forced to be opportunistic in finding ways to see. They had to look very, very carefully, more carefully than they would if they had a project close to home. And I believe they honed and refined their observation skills. They benefited from working in in an unfamiliar context, which really broadens your perspective, and I think in the end helps us designers cultivate empathy for what is unfamiliar, and ultimately, I think that that's what the world needs more now than ever before.